Hello there. Today I'm looking at what I hope is going to be a very interesting wine from a producer whose wines I have reviewed before, but never the Gewurztraminer. So this is Ochota Barrels Weird Berries in the Woods Gewurztraminer, and this is the 2017 vintage of that. So this is a wine from the Adelaide Hills. Now, Ochota Barrels was founded in 2008 by a couple, Taras and Amber Ochota. They'd met in about 2000 and had spent several years travelling largely throughout southern Europe, making wines in other people's wineries, picking up knowledge, having a great fun time before returning to their native South Australia to set up their own quite distinctive, rather individualistic style of winery to make some really very interesting wines. Evidently it was at this stage that Taras went to university to formally learn to make wine. And they set up their winery in the Adelaide Hills. And from this base they take fruit from vineyards in the McLaren Vale, in the Adelaide Hills itself, and from the Barossa Valley. The styles of wines they set out to make are small batch, single vineyard wines. Their approach in the winery is low intervention. In the vineyard, they're non-certified, but they believe in organic cultivation. Yes, minimal intervention in the winery, and just using small amounts of sulphur, so low sulphur, not completely natural wines, but many of them very individualistic. Now, unfortunately, Taras Ochota died in 2020 while still in his late 40s, but Amber has continued to run the winery and makes the wines in pretty much the same style as they were made before his death. However, as I say, this is a 2017, so at that stage Taras would have still been very much involved in the winemaking here. I should perhaps comment on the label. The Ochota Barrels label is quite distinctive, quite simple, but actually I think quite beautiful. Evidently this was designed one Calvados fueled evening, and it represents several things. One, the barrels that are used in the production of most of their wines. Two, it's there to represent a maze. Then I think on top of that there is a third interpretation that the barrels are the barrels of waves while people are surfing. Evidently Taras quite into surfing. So again, open to multi-layered interpretation, much as their wines are. And I think Weird Berries in the Woods really does typify their very individualistic approach to wine production. I believe it comes from the southern end of the Adelaide Hills near Blewett Springs. It's possible that it comes from the Fugazi vineyard, although I've only seen one note of that and it's not been confirmed by anybody else. In which case you're at 550 metres above sea level. You have ironstone with red clay and gravel soils. The climate here is a moderated Mediterranean climate, so moderated both by the altitude and also by cooling breezes that flow between the sea and the Mount Lofty ranges slightly further inland. Taras's approach with this wine was once documented as him saying that basically you take any approach that you'd normally use for producing an aromatic wine and then do something completely different. So unusually for Gewurztraminer, this is picked relatively early. So Taras wanted some of the fruit to be fully ripe, but some to be less so and to still have a crispness and a crunch to it. And that's resulted in a wine that is completely dry and yet only has 11% alcohol. It's much more usual to see Gewurztraminer at sort of 13-14% because producers will hold out for the grapes to have really developed fruit flavour. The hand-picked fruit was crushed and spent 2 to 3 days at cool temperature macerating in the juice prior to fermentation. And this was the idea of making this a textural wine so that some of the tannins are pulled from the skins along with plentiful flavour, but it would be quite normal with an aromatic white to just press the juice straight away. Pressing went on with a basket press and the juice went into seasoned oak barrels for fermentation. Fermentation went on, as always, at Ochota Barrels with the indigenous yeasts that had made their way into the winery on the fruit or were already in the winery. The wine stayed in these barrels, which were French oak barriques, for at least 6 months, with the heavy lees and those being stirred up occasionally. So all to sort of try and give the wine texture and richness and roundness. The wine is unfined but was filtered, and the reason for the filtration was to stop the wine from going through a malolactic conversion, which would have reduced the acidity and might have given some other flavours that would have overlaid some of the aromatics here. And then finally it was bottled with minimum sulphur. The other thing I should note is, looking at 2017 on our website, I note that most of the critics suggest that this should have been drunk up 3 or 4 years ago. So I'll be interested to see how this wine, particularly in the style it's been made with this sort of favouring structure over aromatics, to see how that's aged. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? First of all, looking at the colour, considering that this wine is supposed to be a fully mature wine, it's not particularly deep. I mean, Gewurztraminer can get quite deep colour because it can be quite a pink grape if you pick it when it's fully ripe. I mean, this has a good depth, a medium yellow colour. Swirling it, the 11% alcohol it's giving some tears on the glass, but they're not particularly prominent. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas have a really rich but quite vivid note of rose petals and lychees. While it's quite classically Gewurztraminer, it seems to be more the sort of lower notes, if that makes any sense, of those aromas. It's sort of rich, ripe lychee. It's less of the sort of lifted, delicate rose petal perfume and more of a sort of a richness. And there seems to be a sort of a slight spiciness as well. But let's see what we make of that on the palate, shall we? The first thing you notice is that this is completely dry. And it's actually got, for Gewurztraminer, not a variety that's notorious for high acidity, a real freshness. Got some mouth-watering acidity down the sides of my tongue there, and an almost sort of minerally steeliness. There's also quite an oily texture, and in the midst of this, there is again, it's that highly developed Gewurztraminer rose petal and ripe lychee note, almost sort of to the notes of the lychee skins. That sort of slight woodiness, and some of that is starting to show a little bit of the spice that is noted in the variety's name, Gewurztraminer. And that spice carries on very well. It's lifted a little bit by the clean, fresh acidity. The ripeness and the richness of the texture right across the back palate there, and lasts well. There are still some of these notes of sort of ripe lychee right to the finish. The wine has a good intensity. It does seem slightly unfamiliar for a Gewurztraminer not to have just a little bit of sort of sweetness and a little bit more sort of honeyed voluptuousness on the front palate. But it's certainly an individualistic wine, and it's certainly displaying the flavours and aromas that you'd expect to see from a Gewurztraminer. And also, it doesn't seem to have been particularly adversely affected by being over 7 years old. I think the wine has held up very well. I suspect it might have had a little bit more freshness and liveliness if we'd have drunk it 2 or 3 years ago. I wouldn't think that it's a wine that you'd want to keep particularly long, but I don't feel there's a rush to drink it up either. I think there wouldn't be a problem coming back to this in a year or so's time, because the freshness that's there, the concentration of the fruit, all seem to suggest that it would hold up. Looking at our aggregated critics score, this vintage of this wine gets a 91 out of 100. That seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. Again, given the fact that it does seem to have aged quite effectively, there might be an argument to suggest you could score it slightly higher than that. But at the same time, actually, for a wine of its price, I think that score means it's offering fabulous value for money. I very much doubt that you'll find it easy to find any of the 2017 about. I don't think we have any listings for it remaining. It just happens that I didn't really look at the vintage when I picked it up in the wine shop. I thought it was a wine that interested me. I assumed it was a current vintage. But tasting this certainly encourages me to try subsequent vintages of this wine, and I hope if you do, you enjoy them. Thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you've found the tasting of interest. If you've enjoyed it, do please press the like button. If you want to watch more of these videos, it would be fantastic if you could sign up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have any comments you want to leave, please pop those in the comments box below. We'd be very interested to see what you think about the wines we're looking at, the tastings we're doing, or anything else that relates to that. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, it would be fantastic if you'd consider sharing it with them. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can look at it and see what pricing availability is like both for this vintage, and you can look at other vintages, and you can also see any background information we have on the wine there. So thank you again for joining us, and I do hope you'll manage to make some time in the very near future and come and join us for another tasting, won't you? Bye for now.